This is uh, this is Gary Whitgriff. I'm on the board of directors of the North American Millets Alliance. And today we have two great speakers. We're going to be focusing on the uses of foxtail millets today. And so we're going to start out with Alan Williams. Please introduce yourself and give us a little background on in some of the activities you're doing with foxtail millet.
Appreciate that, Gary. So good morning, everyone. I'm Alan Williams. I'm one of the founding partners of Understanding Ag, the Soil Health Academy, and our more recent launch, a company we launched about 4 years ago called Regenerative Ag. So within those three companies, our core focus is on regenerative agriculture, and we work up and down the food value chain. We work obviously with many different farmers, ranchers, and growers, both here in North America and on 6 continents around the world. We also work quite heavily with food processors, grain elevators, you name it in that respect, and with retailers and wholesalers. And we do a lot of consumer education as well. So we try to hit all angles of this and work with all aspects of those who both grow and consume food.
Being you brought it up, it's a little bit different angle than I expected, but you said you work with the food angle, but also the forage and the seed angle. I was assuming it was mainly from the seed perspective, developing a forage. Could you segregate those a bit?
Yeah, so we're heavily involved in quite a bit of research, and we're always doing farm scale, type research. Not, I am a former university researcher and professor, so very familiar with the reductionist model that is typically employed there, and your typical small plot research station type work. But what we do now is wholly focused in terms of our research. Our farm research is wholly focused on farm scale, because that's what really matters, because every farm, every individual farm has a different context. And when we're trying to do, the reductionist model, very controlled research, we find that often it doesn't translate nearly as well as we might have thought to what actually goes on an individual farm.
Yeah.
So our focus is very much on that farm scale research, very contextual, observation driven, so that we can take into account all of the variables that are impacting what may occur. And then, of course, we are heavily involved in advising our clients, our farmer, rancher, grower clients, all the way from, what happens with the soil and in the soil, all the way through to their marketing. So we're involved in every aspect of their production.
Okay, so it's not only forage, you actually have some growers that harvest for seed, and that seed is either used in the value chain, the food chain, or the seed for planting.
Yes, that will be correct. So among our clients, there will be those that have a multiplicity of uses for millets, and specifically foxtail millet, which, as we know, also goes by a number of other names. We can talk about that a little later. So that I think it is important that everybody understand that, because there's a lot of seed companies out there that will not call it foxtail millet. They'll have another name, whether it's German millet, Italian millet, or whatever that they assign to it. And part of that is perception, because there are plants that many farmers consider weeds, like yellow foxtail, that type of thing. And so I think in green foxtail and so forth. So I think that a lot of seed companies have avoided the term foxtail, for that reason. But it is important that our listeners understand that distinction. But yes, to answer your question, Gary, Among our clients, foxtail millets and other millets are planted for a multiplicity of reasons. One may be cover cropping, to provide cover crops in between the cash crops. Another is for grazing, for their livestock. So we certainly have quite a few clients that are using foxtail millet and others for that. Many of our clients are also incorporating it for wildlife purposes, wildlife food and habitat. We have clients that are harvesting it for seed, and that's multi-purpose. That seed oftentimes goes back into the cover crop sector, to continue to plant as a cover crop, but it also goes into the human food sector. So we have clients that are producing foxtail millet and other millets that will go into the human food sector. And one of the things that we have clearly seen is that among the consumer population, they are now encountering a far greater awareness of their foods that they consume and the nutritional quality and value and density of those foods. And because of that, millets offer an incredible opportunity. And I think we are going to see more and more millet entering the food chain, as a result of that.
Yes, that's good. I would ask that other than speakers, if you could mute your mics, please, to avoid interruptions. Before we jump to Zach, Alan, you brought up something that I think is critical to actually tracking millets. There are so many millets around the world that it's very confusing for people, especially as they're entering the millet market. There are, in 2024, Farm Service Agency ended the year with reporting, farmers within the government program reported just over 1 million acres. I think it's like 1,070,000 acres or something like that of all millets, including teff, in the US. But of those, foxtail millet was third on the list behind proso and pearl. Actually, maybe even teff was up there. Part of the issue is that why would a grower even raising a forage be registering his crop with Farm Service Agency because it's a non-program crop? So what is interesting is proso acres, because it's mostly harvested for grain, makes up roughly half of that 1 million acres. The next biggest category is common, meaning that farmers report common, and Zach starts smiling because they report common because pearl might be common in Georgia. Foxtail millet is certainly common in western South Dakota. Proso is the common millet in Akron, Colorado. So a brown top is common in the southeast. So it's a confused category, and by having food processors say, "Oh, I'm going to call it German," or "I'm going to call it Italian," that's fine. But the grower, from the grower standpoint, really needs to know that it's foxtail. It's foxtail German. What happened and what's recorded under FSA is that proso is not listed separately. It's listed as Dove proso. Anybody that's familiar with Dove know this as the Southeast developed, 40 years ago. It was developed for the Southeast. And so a grower in Colorado, which never plants Dove, the only way he can report his proso millet is either other, meaning common, or Dove. And so I've been working with FSA, and we just submitted it takes now 60 days after this process is going to break that out separately. So for right now, I think it's in our interest, or the interest of the millet market, to have foxtail only listed as foxtail, okay? And proso only listed as proso, teff only listed as teff, no varieties. Pearl the same way. There's lots of hybridized pearls, but let's not go down that angle trying to get every one of those on FSA. It'll be very, very confusing. So Thank you, Ellen, with that. And let's move to Zach. And Zach, let's do an introduction and give us some of your background in the projects you're working on.
Sure. Yeah. I want to thank you for having me today. It's always a pleasure to get on and talk about the different cover crops that we're using and how we're using it in the unique context of it. But a little bit of background of me. So I grew up in Southeast Kansas, and I got started in the cover crop and soil health business just as soon as I graduated from our local business college. And since then, that was about 8 years ago. That's all I've really done. I ran a little cover crop seed company, learning more about it, going to all the conferences, and then Green Cover purchased a facility not far from where I live. Actually, it's across the road, 200 yards ish from where I actually live. So that worked out really well. Transitioned over to them, and I had all that background of knowledge and education to be able to sell cover crop seed. And one of the things that I really like to emphasize in the sales is the education part of it. Green Cover as a whole, that is our goal, is to educate. We want to educate our producers, whether they're growing, your standard commodities of corn, soybeans, and wheat, or maybe several of our producers are growing the different types of millets, just like you were just talking about. We need to match those contexts with practical application. And that's one thing that I really like to focus on. So we have a farm in Southeast Kansas that we're using a lot of different cover crops on. We have a pretty decent forage forage rotation that will rotate through a lot of our crop ground acres. And I guess I would describe it as play. So we don't do university style test strips. We do real life test strips. We're using the drill that we would on our regular acres. We're planting different passes in different places and different soil structures. And then we'll take it to whole farms and try it to see what's actually working and what may not work here. You made a really good point how your foxtail millets are in this area, and then your brown tops might be in the southeast, and your hybrid pearls are coming out of Texas and they grow in certain areas. Well, that's super important information. We're putting these different crops in mixes because we don't want someone to have a failure with the cover crop mix. I always use the analogy like you go into your local coffee shop. Yeah, I think farmers still do it. I truly believe they still do it in the mornings. And they're sitting there, and it was, say they just had a bad year last year. Corn crop completely failed. They got their insurance check. They're telling their neighbors, oh, it was awful, whatever. Well, then the next year they go plant corn again. It doesn't stop them from planting corn again. But if they have a cover crop mix and are uninformed on their context or how to manage that cover crop, and it fails, and they go into the coffee shop, seen this more than once, and they say, oh, this cover crop failed. It was terrible. I'm never doing that again. That one time they'll stop. And the worst part is they're telling their friends that are sitting at that table that they had a bad experience with that cover crop, and they may never plant a cover crop now. So for us to be able to match the context of their situation to these species and varieties is super important. And I pride myself on being able to relate with those producers. I'm not just going to give them a theoretical, well, you should set your drill like this, and this is kind of how it should behave. I want to be able to give them, in all things working in comparison, this is what it should behave as. Obviously, we have rainfall, temperatures, and stuff to change, but we want to give them that. And then one other thing that I really am lucky to be able to be a part of is I'm the seed purchasing lead at Green Cover. So all the seed that we sell through our business, I get to purchase and help guide our contract production manager through how many acres we get. And in doing that, we work directly with producers of foxtail millet. And it's very interesting. I'm looking forward to a lot of this discussion. Because in Southeast Kansas, we don't grow foxtail millet for grain or seed production. Like, it's just not a crop that rotates in and out of well, because of several factors. But I get to deal with people who have directly grown it and have grown different varieties of it and have seen the different changes in plant structures. So it's a very unique opportunity to be able to present the producer the trial, the seed buyer. And then one final step is I actually have been working with a couple farms in Africa, Malawi and Zambia, and we sent some cover crop seed over to them last year, the one in Malawi specifically. And part of that cover crop seed was some foxtail millet. And communicating with some other people from Africa, you know, you've got your finger millet and stuff like that they're using for food. And I'm like, I think you should try this to see what it does. And it grew really well. And they're always looking for more food sources for that part of the country. You know, 85% of their lifelong diet is shima, which is ground maize. So if we can add a diversity to that food system into some of those other regions that produces well, that's very important, is easy to harvest and hand harvest, not mechanically. It can really open up a lifeline to a lot of those communities. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here and talk about this quite a bit further.
Well, this is, we want this hour to be a very educational session. And both Ellen and yourself, Zach, have delved into different topics we need to get more specific on. But your African example is very pertinent, because what you do in Southeast Kansas and the rotation, and then I assume you're conditioning seed, different seeds. You bring in the foxtail millet and then condition it, and conditioning seeds. You know, growers that, for example, harvest foxtail millets want that seed to be viable, not just, you know, in a bird seed mix, for example, you know, a caged bird. And so you have different requirements than that they would have. And so when you send seed to different areas, you want to obviously ensure that it's high quality. Could you get into that a little bit, how you qualify your seed as actually, the foxtail millet especially, qualify it as seed rather than a reject batch?
Sure. So the first thing that we do when we're looking or taking samples from producers is we will send off a germination test initially before we even clean it, move it. Like, we've got a composite test that we put together. The grower does that for us, and we send it in for a germination, because there's no sense in getting started down that path if the germination isn't there.
And what germination are you looking for foxtail in particular?
Well, our historicals almost exclusively stay over 90. That foxtail millet's very good. One interesting enough thing, and this was new to us even this year, we had pulled a sample from the grower this fall, sent it in before it ran across anything besides the combine and an auger, and we had I want to say 25 or 30% dormant seeds, which was something that we had never seen before. But you know what we understood what that meant was it just needs to go through some chilling and go through that process of cleaning. But still, once you figure your total live germination of those, it was still in the 90s. So I guess that's where we start. And then
let's stop. Let's address that specifically. So
okay.
It sounds to me like, having been, you know, had my own seed conditioning plant, it sounds to me like that sample may have been collected not long after harvest, which means it didn't go through what farmers call the sweat period. And maybe talk about that, where storage actually encourages free germination.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. If you pull it right out of the combine, like you said, which is what was happening, and ideally is where we like to start, because if we go into a project, especially something like the foxtail millet, where it's a small seed and you're fighting small weeds, it's very important. So yeah, going through that conditioning process and putting it in that bin and letting it more or less sweat, I guess it doesn't necessarily generate a whole bunch of moisture like you would think a perspiration sweat is, but it still goes through that process of, I mean, it's basically sitting and letting it sit in that bin. And then what we've seen even is once that temperature can drop in that bin, aeration systems are critical for a lot of our seed production. We run AGI SureTrack on almost every one of our seed bins and encourage our producers to run that as well. we try to draw that temperature and moisture down into that holding range. And once we do that, a lot of times we can break that dormancy on a lot of those seeds.
Yeah. Very, very good points. Just background from a technical standpoint, the reason that seeds don't germinate right away and go into a dormant period, and wheat and other things do the same thing, other crops do the same thing, is because you don't want them germinating in the head. So naturally, seeds do not germinate in the head. They wait to be harvested, as we'll call them hard seed, and then go through what farmers call the sweat, or the storage period, in order to activate the germination. So I'm going to jump back to Ellen, because you started bringing up an issue of foxtail competing with weeds. Ellen, do you want to address that from a grower standpoint, where he's trying to plant good quality forage and has trouble with a foxtail millet? Say it's 220,000 seeds per pound, your tiny, tiny millet, and there are planting issues that I want both of you to address when you have that small a seed, which obviously can't, come from 4 inches down. So address your pure stand and some of your weed issues, how you avoid those, Ellen.
Yeah, so one thing is that, we have found foxtail to be very aggressive. Okay. So it does have the ability to be quite competitive. We often incorporate it into mixes, whether it be a cover crop mix or an annual grazing mix, along with, quite a few other species in that mix. But
Species
foxtail,
like oats or rye, or
well, typically because foxtail's a warm season, it's going to be incorporated into a warm season annual mix. So other things that potentially would be in that mix, as an example, would be a sorghum sedan grass of some type, whether it's a BMR, brachytic BMR, whatever. Oftentimes we'll put 2 or 3 millets, including foxtail, into the same mix, whether it's for cover crop or grazing.
what 3 are common? What 3 would be the common?
It depends on the part of the country.
Sure.
Quite frankly, but so in my part of the country, I'm in Mississippi, so let's take the southeast and the deep south. We're often going to look at a foxtail in our mix. I really like that quite a bit. We do use pearl quite often, and or Japanese millet. So that can be, those are typical that we're going to incorporate into a mix. Now, if it's for a cover crop, then obviously we're going in either interseeding into an existing cash crop like corn. We're doing more and more interseeding into corn, into 40 and 60-inch rows, and it works quite well there. Or again, we're doing it for grazing purposes, for summer grazing.
That's after the corn is harvested then?
Well, we see in corn, we're either going in immediately after harvest, or we're actually interseeding at anywhere from V2 to V4 stage, typically.
Okay. Oh, early.
Yeah, so we're doing more and
You
more
interseeding. Let's address just briefly the soil temperatures. You say there's a warm season versus cool season, and I want that cleared up, because oats, for example, is a cool season spring annual, where rye is a winter annual. You can plant it in the fall, obviously. And so address the soil temperatures and the millet seeding, could you?
Yes, so we far prefer, and where we have seen the greatest success, is soil temperatures at 60 degrees or above. But also keep in mind that in many of these mixes, we're also incorporating a sorghum sedan grass. And sorghum sedan grass, the millets can germinate and grow at a little cooler temperature, but the sorghum sedan grass, when it's in the mix as well, it does not perform well at a cooler temperature, under 60. So we definitely want to see a 60 degree or above, pretty steady soil temperature before we go in and seed these mixes.
Okay. Now let's address the seeding depth and you're working with two different size seeds. Zach, I want you to follow up on addressing how you set your drill or what kind of drills you're going to need in order to plant a very diverse seed size in the same planting, same pass. So you want to cover it first, Alan?
I'd be happy to share what we do and our clients do. So because we don't often plant millet, foxtail, or otherwise by itself, we do have some clients that are doing that specifically for grain production, but if it's for a cover crop, for grazing, for wildlife, anything like that, it's always planted as part of a broader mix. We'll have the seed company like Green Cover Seed, they will pre-mix.
Mhm.
And frankly, we just simply don't have a problem, with these pre-mixed, cover crop mixes.
What kind of a drill? What kind of drill and what kind of row spacings are as common?
Well, it's so anywhere from 7.5, and that type of thing is pretty common. But a lot of
Disc drills or hole drills?
We're putting most of it in no-till.
Okay.
So
That's good.
mostly we're using
That's good.
no-till and
Yes, sir.
a variety anywhere from John Deere to Great Plains to Kuhn Krause drills, all of this, and many other types of drills that people can mention and that people have used. But again, we really don't have an issue with that. When we have it pre-mixed, then we typically have good germination and early seedling emergence and vigor. Now, the key, though, is, and you mentioned it earlier, Gary, are two things. One is, making sure you've got the right seeding rate. So you want to make sure that your drill is properly calibrated and that you are, we'll run a couple of test strips and then make sure that we're getting the right seeding rate out. So that's very important. Another is that we have proper down pressure on the drill, so that we are achieving the proper placement of depth and that type of thing. And then the third is, yes, making sure that we do have the proper depth. So
Yeah, what's that proper depth?
yeah, so in almost all of the seedings that we do in these mixes, we're going 3/4 to an inch. We really don't like to go much deeper than an inch, to be honest with you, but 3/4 to an inch is working very, very well for us.
That and also the pack, meaning that if you have a lot of trash out there, and I'll move to Zach just shortly, if you have a lot of trash out there, you're not getting seed to soil contact on every one of those. And so placement is critical. It might be a forage, eventually a forage mix, but placement and volume of seed per row. And when you're looking at Foxtail with 220,000 seeds per pound, and say a sorghum Sudan cross from 12 to 15,000 seeds per pound, it's a huge range. Do you see any settlement where, meaning you plant and you start seeing patches where you're getting almost all Foxtail, and then later on in that drill pass, the bigger seed or the lighter seed tends to float to the top and you get more, we'll say, Sudan?
So that's a very good question. And here is where the ability of the seed company to really do a great job of blending comes into play. We have seen those types of issues, the settling issues and that type of thing, particularly more from like local co-ops and places like that, that frankly just don't have the degree of experience that they need in blending these mixes. And but when you have a good blend, what we do is, when we load the drills and go in and drill, we just really don't have much of an issue with that. And even broadcasting, we've done a lot of broadcast seeding as well, particularly in grazing situations, and then use livestock to sort of walk the seed in, so to speak, get good seed to soil contact. And we're doing just fine when you have the mix of very small seed to larger seed, in the same blend and in the same hoppers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now this, you indirectly hugely promoted a legitimate, high quality seed company, because what you don't want, you can buy a good quality Sudan grass, a good quality pearl, a hybrid pearl, and a foxtail millet or brown top, for example, or Japanese, and go to the drill, dump your 4 bags in and plant. That to me is foolishness. And I think you just described it. Now, Zach, you want to address those issues?
Sure. Yeah. A lot to jump around into there, but you're absolutely right. A lot of the blending issues isn't necessarily the seed settling out. It's having the proper equipment too. Our blenders are designed specifically to get as close as possible to the edges and to lift and stir more horizontally than vertically. And we can get a lot more even movement through those. But then it also even goes to packaging type. If we can like transfer it from the blender to the packaging type, and the less times you have to handle it, the better off you are, because every time you handle it when you're not stirring it is when you start to see that separation. One other important factor to think about is the bulk density of those mixes. So when you start putting them with sorghum Sudan grass, or even even cowpeas, we'll do a foxtail millet and cowpea blend that's fairly easy to do. And you would think, oh, that cowpea seed is huge compared to the foxtail millet, but still the bulk density of those are similar enough that you might have a little bit of separation, but it's nothing like if you put sunflowers. You put sunflowers and foxtail millet together, you could start to see some pretty serious separation, especially if you had a great big air seeder. One thing I want to add.
Let's stop there a little bit and explain bulk density. Some of our listeners might not understand bulk density. For example, foxtail millet will have something around 55, 56 pounds per bushel test weight. Sorghum will say in that same range. Barley at 48, oats 32, and sunflowers at 28 or 26. And so peas, I think, are around 56 bulk density. So what you're suggesting is you want the weight, and it's easy to look up per bushel weight. So that's to me the bulk density. Look at the per bushel weight, and the more even the bulk density of the seed, the better it stays in a mix.
Yeah. A lot of times that's almost exactly what we see. So the big items that people will always make a comment about is your sunflowers and your oats. Those two separate the most, especially if, okay, so we're packaging like 1 pallet's worth in 50-pound bags. The last bag of that blend, if it has a lot of sunflowers in it with a lot of other heavier products, it'll be heavier sunflowers in there, and it just settles out. Or like I mentioned, if somebody's got a large air seeder that has a tank, a 10,000 pound capacity tank, if they put a lot of seed in that and go start bouncing, I mean, it's just like what you would think. It'll just shake those lighter seeds. It shakes the lighter seeds to the top before it shakes the heavier seeds to the bottom. And one thing I want to add on the seeding
on the air seeder, do they use 2 tanks or just 1 tank?
Most of the ones that I'm familiar with are generally just using a single tank. I'm sure the further north you get into larger acres, they may go into a double tank or something like that. But a lot of times with the cover crop mixes, we're not really splitting up stuff to try to separate and plant 2 different species. But as far as the getting it in the ground, one thing I want to point out, I'm a big fan of the single disc drills. I won't name any manufacturers, but I like single disc drills. I own one. And one of the most important things with planting small seed is your depth is the first part. But the second part to that is what you're doing in that seed trench after you drop that seed in it. Seed firmers or some type of bounce up stop equipment will really make a world of difference, especially if you're borderline too dry. You do not want that seed bouncing out of that trench and not getting covered up or just slightly covered up if you're borderline too dry. The better we can keep it in the ground and get better seed to soil contact, the better off you're going to be in your stand. You're just going to be quite a bit happier with that.
Well, with cover crops, you're looking, for example, when I bought seed from green clover several years ago and put it in one of my fields. It was a standard mix that you had that I wanted to try. And so when you have those mixes, how do you recommend a foxtail mix, and how many different seeds do you have in there, and what percent of the seed is foxtail?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we talked about the bulk density of the mix. That's important. I'm a big fan of seeds per acre. When I do cover crop blends, we can do it by pounds per acre all day long, but we've invested a decent bit of money into a couple pretty high-tech seed counters, and we're trying to count a lot of our lot numbers, and we're trying to get it to where when we print out so you get your mix analysis and it goes and it shows you what's in it, but then it also has a bulk density counter. So it makes it easier to set your drill, the bulk density of the mix. So it's a percentage of all the species. But like I said, I'm a big proponent of seeds per acre because you can overdo it and underdo it in these mixes if you have a variation of multiple averages, I would call them. And that's what matters more so than pounds. So we can say, for cover crop seed, you can plant 0.5 to 5 pounds per acre. I mean, well, we could go more than that depending on your context of it, but there's so many, since we do custom mixes, like that's how it works. That's the benefit that you get from like green cover is we can tailor it down to exactly what you need for your situation.
So say you're moving into a fairly dry land mix, and you're a little concerned about some of the drought tolerance and actually getting a decent stand of a forage, for example, cover out there. Alan will address the forage in a bit here, but so do you look specifically at the not only the seed count, which, by the way, that started with corn. People started planting corn. And so then they switched to soybeans, selling seed as a seed count. So you're selling bags of forage, cover crop, meaning as a seed count and recommendation per acre. What is your recommendation? How does it vary from Southeast Kansas, where you get more rain, to Western Kansas, where they get half as much?
Sure. So we actually sell it by the pound, so it doesn't necessarily sell by the seed count. But what I'm saying is when we're making the mix, when I'm putting those individual ingredients in that mix, I'm mentally separating it out by seed count so I can shoot for an appropriate seeds per acre based on the season or where they're at. But to answer your question, so Southeast Kansas, we get 42 inches of rain annually here. 80% of it comes in the spring and the fall, and you get a little bit in the summertime, or Western Kansas, where they may get 14 to 16. There is a big difference. One thing that I would say is those climates that are more extreme, those Western Kansas, Nebraska, wherever you want to nail on it, we're looking at species that are going to be able to handle that. And of those species, foxtail millet is one of them. The other thing that we're looking at is cost of seeding that acre. So their return on investment for that area is, generally speaking, going to be less than what it is where I'm at, because they're not going to be able to grow as much biomass, as much roots, and do as much good. So that's where your seeds per acre comes in play. But we will, a lot of times, diversity is good, don't get me wrong, but in those contexts where this is tough ground, this is a hard situation to be in, they're already a little dry and it doesn't look like they're going to get a lot of rain, we're going to err on the side of caution of, hey, we need to get several plants out there as cheaply as possible. So the easiest way to do that is to put a little bit heavier rate of a small seeded plant in there. So we can take that foxtail millet rate up to 4 or 5 pounds an acre in some of these cover crop mixes, not necessarily take away from other species, but you can almost guarantee that those plants are going to be there, and you're going to get lots of plants per acre with your other crops. And say it does get wet, it's not going to shade nearly as bad as sorghum sudan will. So if they do get a really nice period of rainfall, the mix can express itself, and it's going to be a little heavier grass. But I'm a big fan of grass, and I know Alan is too. Like, that's where your carbon comes from. That's where we get most of our root exudates. That's what feeds the biology in the soil. Grasses are super important, especially when we have the moisture to use them.
Okay. Alan, let's address from your standpoint, seeds per acre and the huge geography where you have different growers. Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Yes, and that is very, very important. Yeah, and so it's very contextual. Yeah, it's not, it is the geography. Yes, that's one of the, the very important contextual points that we're going to look at. Where are you located? And as Zach alluded to earlier, and both of y'all talked about the significant differences between Eastern Kansas and Western Kansas. We see very similar differences in many states, all over the U.S. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to address, the geographical and the specific weather differences in any one area when we look at seeding rate. And that's also going to be adjusted according to exactly what's in the mix. So when we design a mix, the first thing we're thinking about are the resource concerns. All of the various resource concerns that that particular farmer, grower, rancher is going to have. And we want to make sure we're addressing those, with that mix. The other thing that we have to definitely consider, if it's being used as a cover crop and they've been growing a cash crop, what has been their herbicide regime? Because the residual left over from that can absolutely impact what you're going to put in the mix. And so we're going to want that information from the grower if they're a farmer versus a grazer. That's just going to be critically important to us. And we also have to look.
The rotation that they use will give you a hint on if
Yes.
it's atrazine or whatever in there, then you're trying to stick a broadleaf pea or something in it. But
exactly. And we're also going to look at things like, how does this impact the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the soil? So that's certainly a consideration. And then if it's a cover crop, what is their cash crop rotation? Because the in-between cover crop, we have to make sure that it first addresses any issues that may have occurred with the prior cash crop, and that it's going to do a good job of feeding the next cash crop that's coming in that rotation. So all of these things are things that we take into account. If it's a grazing situation, then we want to take into account, are they interseeding this into perennials? And using this to supplement the perennial production? That's one deal. Or is their grazing situation where they're pretty much wholly dependent on the annuals? And are we following a cool season annual planted for grazing with a warm season annual planted for grazing? And then one of the other considerations that we look at very heavily is that, okay, particularly related to seed size and seeding rate, is I want everything in my mix to grow,
Yeah.
and if I go overboard in seeding rate on any one of those things, then that's going to, crowd out, so to speak, and outcompete everything else that I've got in my mix. And and this doesn't have to do with millets, but Zach will know exactly what I'm talking about. But one of the biggest mistakes we often see people make with a cover crop mix is way too much brassica
yeah,
in that mix, and then very little else grows, and they wonder what in the world happened. Well, it's
they have their place, but
yeah. It's so easy to overdo, the small seeds. Okay, you've got to be so. I mean, to Zach's point, he's exactly correct. You've got to be very cognizant of that, and not just thinking about pounds per acre.
yes, let's, we had a question come in, and let's have you address it, and then I'll move to Zach. And that's, what types of foxtail millet varieties? Very, very little research over the years has developed foxtail millets per se, especially in the US. But there are several varieties to choose from. What foxtail millets do you mainly use in your mix?
Well, that's a question that's tough for me to answer, because we're working across 37 million acres in the US and all 50 states.
Okay, before we'll jump to Zach. Zach, think about that. One of my other questions before we start wrapping up here is, how many acres of blends or forages are you involved with? How many acres involve foxtail millets in approximate acres? You don't have to be specific.
Yeah, so my best estimate of that, and I'm going to base this on a year in, year out basis, is that we are including, a foxtail millet in more than 10 million acres a year here. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Zach, let's jump to you on this issue with varieties of foxtail and acres. Let's do varieties first.
Sure. Yeah, the varieties are quite a bit easier, and I'm just going to talk about the ones that we have been producing. And then I'm going to do something that I don't often advocate for and talk about one that's not quite in production yet. So the varieties that we've been producing for a while have been White Wonder.
Okay.
And I'm going to say it like this because I think that's what most people are going to understand it or have heard it by: a Golden German, and a Strain R. Those are the three that we have been primarily producing, and we see benefits to each one depending on where you're at. We believe that the White Wonder does produce more biomass and forage than the Golden German does.
But it produces less seed though, right?
Less seed, yes. Now I'm going to draw a line on, I'm going to call it I-70. North of I-70, those are the better options. The reason mainly is the season of the plant. As you transition south, your Strain R is going to start to be better because it can take a little bit more heat, and also it has a little bit longer season. One really important thing that I've learned about these foxtail millets, and I'm going to lump a lot of millets into this, but foxtail is one that will show it, is the nighttime temperatures. So in southern Kansas, not just southeast, but southern Kansas, our night times, there will be a couple weeks in the summer, like we don't get out of the 80s at night. And the foxtail millet just really doesn't like that, especially those northern varieties. Strain R can handle a little bit better, but they still play well in a cover crop mix. I just, as far as transition zones into which millet is best, that's probably a good spot. But then, like,
just briefly, they perform differently because the soil temperatures, if the air temperature is 80 day and night, or 100 during the day, 80 at night, and you have a bare or relatively bare soil, meaning you're in western Kansas, for example, you don't have much cover, you're just trying to get forage, your temperatures can vary extremely high, way over 80 degrees on surface temperature, compared to if they were planted in wheat stubble, for example, winter wheat stubble. Touch on that just briefly.
Yeah, so that's a good point. It's not just the air temperature, but it is the soil temperature difference. And then to one more caveat past that is humidity. So eastern Kansas, I'm sure everyone's been in a situation, Alan, you live in a situation where it's 80 degrees at night and 85% humidity. And it's really hard for those plants to recover from that. It's not ever really given them a break to where they can more or less shut down and take that break in the evening. It's very hard on them, especially if they weren't bred to do that. Exactly.
Well, they're not bred, because millets are fairly photosensitive yet, where it's kind of bred out of corn. And so photosensitivity means that it's wanting to shut down at night. It's actually measured by night length. But if you have temperatures that and humidity and soil moisture that wants to stimulate growth, it's actually a heavy strain on the plant, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And we see it. And bred isn't necessarily as good as maybe selected. That would be a better term to fit in there.
Yeah.
But that leads into the next thing. So we were visiting a friend in Texas this year, and they're like, "Hey, come over. I want to show you something that I found." And that's usually our favorite conversation, is something that they found. So in the depths of their storage bin, they had this grass that they planted, and they really didn't know what it was because they were in the, pearl millet, sorghum, sedan producing business.
Yeah.
Well, they had found a foxtail millet and had planted it at the same time as their sorghums and their plots and stuff. And it was on like 120 days and hadn't made grain yet. And it grew really, really well. It stayed vegetative for a super, super, super long time. And it was very, very interesting, and looks like it could be a really good fit for a fuller season fit to foxtail millet, because that is a downside or a drawback to it, is if a guy wants to plant a really full season mix, maybe they're going in the middle of May and they're going to let it grow all summer long. Well, the foxtail millet's going to run its course quicker. It's going to make grain, especially if they're not grazing it. And it's gonna be completed its life cycle. Whereas if we could stretch something out there that would last longer, it would fit into those situations quite a bit better.
Okay. Could you address the acres a little bit? And then I have another question I would like both of you to address. How many acres do you think in your business or in the US is there foxtail millets in the cover crop blend?
That is very difficult to measure. I was talking to Keith Burns, one of the brothers that started Green Cover, about that just the other day. And he agreed, like, it is so hard to calculate how many acres it is because it's going in blends. And when you start putting 1 pound per acre in something, you could almost touch the same acre a couple times if you're really getting wild with it too.
Right, because you could have more than one millet in there, for example.
Yep.
Or two different varieties of millet, or two different varieties of foxtail.
Yep. Or like I said, if somebody planted a haying mix in May, maybe they grew exclusively foxtail millet in May, hate it, they could go back in with a cover crop mix after they hate it and have foxtail millet again. So
okay, so of the cover crops that USDA reports, the acres, the man's acres of cover crops, what percent of that do you think would have millet in it?
I could get closer to that. It's easier to justify summertime mixes versus fall mixes. I would say, if we're looking at the numbers of acres that we sell, and I would think that our percentage of a summertime mix having a foxtail millet in it, it's probably 85 or 90% of the time. I would say most of our summer mixes do.
Okay.
So now then, to take that back into context, your cover crop acres reported by the USDA. Oh, Alan, you can throw a number at this too, but I bet 70% of those are mostly fall acres. So that would leave 30% of the acres to be a summertime mix, and say 85% of that number would be a foxtail millet acre.
That makes sense. Ellen, you want to address that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. But the other thing, there's a lot that are not accounted for by the USDA.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And why? Explain
yeah.
why, because I think
Yeah.
this confuses a lot of people.
Yeah, well, a handful of things. First of all, if I'm a grazer, a rancher, whatever, and I'm not a row crop farmer, I'm not reporting.
Right.
I'm not reporting, and I'm not required to report,
Right.
So all of those acres go wholly unnoted by the USDA in terms of, cover crop. I mean, essentially an annual is a cover crop going in there. It's the same thing.
Even though that some of the growers may harvest some of the foxtail for seed, it's never reported because it's a non-program crop, and they don't look, there's no insurance or anything on it. So that's where Zach and others get the seed from.
That is absolutely correct. And you couple that with the fact that, and look, let's be very honest, there's many farmers, row crop farmers, who do not fully report and accurately report, and they'll tell you that to your face. I mean, I have a lot of them that'll tell me.
To be fair, they plant wheat, pull off wheat early enough they might stick some millet in and harvest the millet in the fall before they replant winter wheat, for example. Now, they report their wheat, but they have no reason to report that second forage out there. Okay. And so
that's correct.
all right. Now, we got 5 more minutes, so I'm going to ask you one question, and then I would think about how you want to summarize and recommendations that you would make. The one question that I think a lot of growers have when planting millet, and it brought up the beginning of the conversation, pigeon grass versus foxtail versus actual foxtail millet as a crop. How do you answer the question, will I get volunteer in my following crop? And if I do get volunteer, how will I going to take care of it?
So when you talk about foxtail millet versus green foxtail, yellow foxtail, all these other things.
But it all gets blended in the farmer's mind. I want to address, how do you address the issue with foxtail millet seed potentially volunteering and how you take care of it?
So foxtail millet is a true annual, okay?
Yes.
And it is not, you're not going to have a problem with this. We just simply haven't seen a problem with that like you do with the, with the green foxtail, yellow foxtail, pigeon grass, all of those types of things, because they are a very different seed and they are not a true annual like the foxtail millet is.
Okay, from a historic standpoint, foxtail millet's been around for thousands of years.
Yes.
And it's been selected out for different characteristics where the weeds have not been selected out. That is the major difference between any crop versus a weed. Okay.
Yep.
Zach, you want to address this volunteer issue?
Sure. So I've grown non-GMO crops for several years, soybeans, non-GMO corn, stuff like that. And we also have a lot of organic producers. And usually what I lead into is there's no difference in the possibility of volunteer foxtail millet than there is anything else, because it's a matter of how you manage that cover crop. And if you let it do that, it will do that. It's a great grain producer. I mean, that's one of the things that we talk about it. Now, as far as you're exactly right, that biennial or perennial green foxtail versus yellow foxtail. So usually how I would describe it to a producer, if they come up with concerns, is I would mention, a good comparison would be wild buckwheat versus buckwheat that we put into your cover crop seed mix.
Good point.
That's a really easy one for people to start to understand because they see and can relate to it quite a bit. But it's always good to lead with, like Alan mentioned quite a while ago, what's your crop rotation? What are you going to next year? Let's plan ahead in case something does happen and there you do get a great seed crop out there. Like, how are you going to manage that next year? How are you able to manage that next year? We actually had a great learning experience is what I called it. At Green Cover, we have lots of test plots. Well, last year they had planted a big mix, very heavy mix under irrigation that had foxtail millet in it and some sorghum sudan, and the foxtail millet went to seed. And then we went to plant our summer test plots in it last summer. And sure enough, there was baby foxtail millet all over the ground.
Right. See, it doesn't need to be, it can germinate on the surface. We're right at the very end of this. I don't mean to cut off any conversations, but take a minute, Ellen, to sum up what you would recommend as far as using foxtail millets. Zach, do the same thing. What's your key takeaways?
So first and foremost, it's a very viable part of a broader mix that absolutely should be considered. It has incredible traits. It also has, it can grow in a variety of climates, weather conditions, that type of thing, and perform quite well. But one thing to absolutely note is that the better the functioning of your soil, if I have more highly aggregated soil, more biological functioning in that soil, then any of these mixes that I'm going to plant are going to perform better, and they're going to withstand, they're going to be far more resilient. Okay, so that's one thing to note, is that the way that they perform in degraded soils is very different than the way that they perform in soils that have been regenerated. So
So
don't,
you need somebody experienced with those before you just go plant them and have a failure. Okay.
that's correct.
Zach, you want to just wrap up with a couple bullet points? I really appreciate it. This is a very interesting conversation. I could go on for another 2 or 3 hours, but we're limited to an hour. Zach, you want to wrap?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with that, Alan. Everything you explained there. One thing I'd like to add is I said that it was probably in 85% of our summer mixes. The reason for that is it's a good widespread crop, but it's also very affordable. It's easy to use. It's a low seeding rate. It's something that's vigorous, that gets started easy. It's an easy crop to grow.
Yep. Very good. Very good. Well, we're just over an hour, and I look forward to having this posted. Please encourage others that want to see this. Go to the YouTube and look up Millets Alliance, North American Millets Alliance. This will be posted shortly. Some of our other previous webinars are on there. And I really thank you, Alan and Zach with Green Cover. To me, this was an excellent introduction to the broad uses of foxtail millet that are simply not reported by what is our statistical gathering agency, the National Ag Statistics Service. So thank you so much, and let's wrap it up today, and I look forward to visiting with you more.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. That was fantastic. Take care.